What if I told you that in July 1942, a British admiral ordered an Allied convoy of 35 merchant ships to scatter, to break formation and flee individually across the Arctic Ocean, based on intelligence that turned out to be completely wrong? And then he watched from London, over 1,000 miles away, as German aircraft and U-boats hunted down the scattered ships one by one, sinking 24 of them over the next week. Over 150 merchant seamen died, frozen in lifeboats, drowned when their ships were torpedoed, burned alive in fuel oil fires on the Arctic water's surface. The convoy was PQ-17, one of the Arctic convoys that ran supplies from Britain and America to the Soviet port of Murmansk. The route passed through some of the most hostile waters on Earth, U-boat hunting grounds within range of German air bases in Norway, and shadowed constantly by the threat of the Tirpitz, Germany's last operational battleship. The order to scatter was meant to save the convoy from the Tirpitz, which intelligence suggested was about to attack. But the Tirpitz never came. She'd turned back hours before the order was given. Intelligence that never reached the admiral who made the decision. So the convoy scattered, the ships fled alone into the Arctic, and the Germans, who couldn't believe their luck, picked them off one by one. It was one of the greatest maritime disasters of World War II, and it was entirely avoidable. This is the story of PQ-17. To understand PQ-17's disaster, you need to understand the Arctic convoys and why they existed at all. The Soviet lifeline. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Stalin's military was catastrophically unprepared. The initial German advance captured or destroyed massive amounts of Soviet equipment. Soviet industry was being evacuated east beyond the Urals, but it would take time to rebuild production capacity. The Soviet Union desperately needed supplies: tanks, aircraft, trucks, ammunition, food, raw materials. Britain and America, now allied with the Soviet Union through shared enemy status, committed to providing them. But how? The Soviet Union's western borders were occupied by Germany. The Black Sea was hostile. The Far East ports were too distant from the fighting front. The only viable route was the Arctic. Convoys from Britain or Iceland to the Soviet port of Murmansk in the far north, above the Arctic Circle, one of the few ice-free ports accessible year-round. The route was approximately 2,000 miles through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The Arctic route. The Arctic Ocean in summer, when PQ-17 sailed, experiences near-constant daylight above the Arctic Circle. This meant German aircraft and U-boats could operate around the clock. There was no night to hide in, no darkness to break contact. The weather was violent and unpredictable. Storms could scatter convoys, damage ships, and make navigation treacherous. Ice flows could puncture hulls. Freezing spray turned ships into ice-laden death traps where men could slip and fall overboard into water, cold enough to kill in minutes. And then there was the Tirpitz. The Tirpitz, the phantom threat. The Tirpitz was Nazi Germany's last operational battleship after the Bismarck's sinking in May 1941. She was based in Norwegian fjords, perfectly positioned to strike at Arctic convoys. Her actual combat record was minimal. She rarely left port, but her mere existence tied down enormous British naval resources. The Admiralty had to assume every Arctic convoy might be attacked by the Tirpitz, so they had to provide heavy escort, battleships, carriers, cruisers, that couldn't be used elsewhere. Churchill called the Tirpitz the Beast and obsessed over her destruction. The threat wasn't what she'd done, but what she could do if she sortied against a convoy. Slaughter merchant ships faster than escorts could respond. By July 1942, the Arctic convoy system had been running for a year. Losses were heavy but acceptable. PQ-16 in May 1942 had lost 7 of 35 ships. Painful, but not catastrophic. PQ-17 would be different. June 27, 1942. Convoy PQ-17 assembled in Hvalfjordur, Iceland, a barren fjord that served as a staging point for Arctic convoys. The ship's 35 merchant ships, American, British, Panamanian, Dutch. They carried 297 aircraft, 594 tanks, 4,246 vehicles, and over 150,000 tons of general cargo. Weapons, ammunition, food, fuel, raw materials. This wasn't just a supply convoy. This was enough equipment to outfit multiple Soviet divisions. The crews were merchant seamen, not military personnel but civilians under contract. Many were in their 40s and 50s, too old for military conscription. Some were teenagers on their first voyages. They weren't soldiers. They were sailors doing a job, and the job happened to involve sailing through war zones. They knew the risks. PQ convoys had been taking casualties for a year, but they also knew that convoy meant protection, escort ships, coordinated defense, safety in numbers. The escort PQ-17's close escort consisted of 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, 4 armed trawlers, 2 anti-aircraft ships, 2 submarines. Additionally, a covering force of cruisers sailed nearby: HMS London, HMS Norfolk, USS Wichita, USS Tuscaloosa. Further behind, providing distant cover, the battleships HMS, Duke of York and USS Washington, the carrier HMS, Victorious, and supporting vessels. This was massive protection for a merchant convoy and over 40 warships protecting 35 merchant vessels. The Admiralty was taking PQ-17 seriously. The commander of the convoy's escort was commanded by Commander Jack Broom on the destroyer HMS Keppel. He was an experienced officer who understood Arctic convoy operations. But the critical decisions wouldn't be his to make. Those would come from Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord, operating from the Admiralty in London, over 1,000 miles from the Arctic. This command structure was already problematic. The man making tactical decisions couldn't see the tactical situation. He would rely entirely on delayed intelligence reports and his own judgment. June 27, 1942. PQ-17 departed Iceland heading northeast toward Murmansk. The first days. The initial voyage was tense but uneventful. The convoy maintained formation, ships in columns, escorts patrolling the perimeter, aircraft from the carrier providing occasional air cover. On June 30th, German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy. This was expected. German air bases in northern Norway routinely tracked Arctic convoys. Shadowing aircraft circled beyond anti-aircraft range, reporting the convoy's position, speed, and composition. The first attack came on July 2nd, torpedo bombers from northern Norway. The attack was repulsed by convoy anti-aircraft fire and escort fighters. No ships were lost. July 3rd, another air attack. 1 merchant ship damaged but able to continue. The escorts were performing their job. The convoy was holding together. But in the Admiralty in London, Admiral Pound was receiving intelligence reports that made him increasingly nervous. The Tirpitz reports British intelligence, through signal intercepts and reconnaissance, reported that German surface ships, including the Tirpitz, had sortied from their Norwegian bases. This was true. On July 2nd, the Tirpitz, the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer, and the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, along with destroyers, had left port and were moving toward probable interception positions. This was the nightmare scenario the Admiralty had feared. The Tirpitz attacking a convoy that she could destroy faster than battleship escorts, still hundreds of miles away, could intervene. Admiral Pound faced an impossible decision: keep the convoy together, maintain escort protection, and hope the covering battleships could engage the Tirpitz if she attacked, or order the convoy to scatter, making the merchant ships harder to find, but also stripping them of coordinated defense. The intelligence gap. What Pound didn't know, what British intelligence had not yet reported, was that the German surface force had already turned back. German Naval Command had authorized the sortie but imposed strict conditions: no engagement with superior British forces, no operation if British carriers were nearby. When German reconnaissance confirmed that British carriers were within range, the operation was cancelled. The Tirpitz and her escorts returned to Norwegian fjords on the evening of July 4th. They never came within 500 miles of PQ-17. But this intelligence didn't reach London in time. July 4th, 1942, 9/11. p.m. Admiral Pound in London sent a signal to the convoy. Most immediate. Cruiser force withdraw to westward at high speed. 9 minutes later at 9:23 p.m. Most immediate. Convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. Then at 9:36 p.m., the final fatal message. Most immediate. Convoy is to scatter. The difference disperse and scatter have specific meanings in naval terminology. Disperse. Ships break formation but remain in general proximity, can potentially regroup. Scatter. Ships flee independently at maximum speed in different directions. Complete abandonment of formation. Pound had ordered scatter, the most extreme option. Commander Broom, aboard HMS Keppel with the convoy, couldn't believe the signal. He checked with his communications officer to confirm it had been decoded correctly. It had. The order made no sense. There had been no contact with German surface ships. No indication the Tirpitz was nearby. The convoy was still relatively concentrated, the escorts were in position, and defensive formation had been working. But orders were orders. Broom signaled the merchant ships, scatter. The chaos. Within hours, PQ-17 ceased to exist as a convoy. 35 merchant ships fled in all directions at their maximum speeds, which varied widely. Some ships could make 10 knots, others barely 6 knots. The escorts, destroyers and cruisers withdrew westward as ordered, leaving the merchant ships unprotected except for the small anti-aircraft ships and trawlers that couldn't keep up with the fleeing merchantmen. The merchant seamen were bewildered and terrified. They'd been told convoy formation was safety. Now they were alone in the Arctic with no escort, no coordinated defense, no plan, except run toward Murmansk and hope. And the Germans couldn't believe their luck. July 5th to 10th, 1942. German U-boats and aircraft hunted scattered PQ-17 ships across the Barents Sea. The U-boat hunt U-boats, which had been tracking the convoy, now faced individual targets with no escort protection. They positioned themselves along likely routes to Murmansk and waited. One by one, merchant ships appeared, steaming alone, defenseless, easy targets. The SS Christopher Newport, torpedoed July 5th, crew abandoned ship, vessel sank. The SS William Hooper, torpedoed July 5th, broke in half, sank in minutes. 22 crew members died. The SS Earlston, torpedoed July 5th, burned and sank. The survivors floated in lifeboats in Arctic waters for days before being rescued. The pattern repeated. Individual merchant ships, no protection, torpedoed by U-boats that could take their time lining up shots. The air attacks German bomber squadrons from Norway flew continuous sorties. Without convoy anti-aircraft coordination, individual ships were easy targets. The bombers used a mix of high-level bombing and torpedo attacks. Ships that survived the initial strikes often caught fire, fuel oil spreading across the water's surface and igniting, turning the sea itself into a wall of flames. The SS Washington, bombed July 5th, caught fire, abandoned. The crew rowed lifeboats away from the burning ship, while German aircraft continued attacking other vessels in sight, the Arctic itself. But the most lethal element was the Arctic environment. When ships were hit, crews had minutes to abandon ship before she went down. They launched lifeboats into water that was 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill through hypothermia in 15 to 30 minutes without immersion suits. Lifeboats drifted for days. Some crews were rescued by other merchant ships that had survived. Some made it to the Soviet coast. Many froze to death in the boats. One particularly haunting account, a lifeboat from the SS Olopana was found weeks after the convoy by Soviet patrol vessels. All 7 men in the boat were dead, frozen in sitting positions. One man had his hand extended toward a tin of food he'd apparently been trying to open when he died. The few that survived. Of the 35 merchant ships in PQ-17, only 11 reached Murmansk. 24 were sunk, 2/3 of the convoy lost. Over 150 merchant seamen died, 430 tanks, 210 aircraft, 3,350 vehicles, and 99,316 tons of cargo went to the bottom of the Arctic. Among the survivors were ships that had deliberately steered north toward the ice pack, reasoning that German aircraft and U-boats would avoid the most dangerous waters. They spent days navigating through ice floes, their hulls scraping against ice, risking being crushed, but avoiding the German hunting grounds further south. The tactic worked for those who tried it, but most ships had fled east or southeast, the direct routes to Murmansk, where they ran directly into the German gauntlet. When the survivors of PQ-17 reached Murmansk between July 10th to 25th, the scale of the disaster became clear. The reckoning Admiral Pound had made the decision to scatter based on his assessment that the Tirpitz was about to attack. His assessment was wrong. The Tirpitz had already turned back. But even if the Tirpitz had attacked, scattering would have been catastrophic. A concentrated convoy with destroyer, escort, and cruiser support could have fought, possibly causing enough damage to the Tirpitz to force her withdrawal. Scattered ships had no chance. Pound had chosen the option that guaranteed heavy losses to avoid the possibility of heavy losses. The decision haunted him. In September 1943, 14 months after PQ-17, Pound died of a brain tumor. Some historians have speculated that the stress of the PQ-17 disaster contributed to his decline. What's documented is that he knew the decision had been catastrophic, and that merchant seamen had died because of it. The convoy system suspended after PQ-17, Arctic convoys were suspended until September 1942. The political and military fallout was severe. Stalin accused Britain of cowardice. Churchill had to explain to Roosevelt why American merchant ships and cargo had been lost. When convoys resumed, they operated differently. Larger escorts, more air cover, better intelligence coordination, and strict orders that convoys would not scatter except under direct attack. PQ-18, in September 1942, lost 13 of 40 ships. Still heavy losses, but achieved through actual combat, not through abandonment of defensive formation. The merchant seamen. The survivors of PQ-17 were traumatized. Many refused to sail Arctic convoys again. Some left the merchant service entirely. Those who did sail again carried the psychological burden of having been ordered to scatter, of watching their convoy mates die alone while they fled, of floating in lifeboats not knowing if anyone was searching for them, of understanding that they had survived partly through luck. One survivor, interviewed decades later, said, "I was 19 years old. I watched 5 ships burning at the same time. I saw men jump into burning oil. I heard them screaming. That doesn't leave you." The British government eventually held an inquiry. The official report published in 1945 concluded that the decision to scatter had been wrong, but stopped short of assigning blame to Admiral Pound personally. The report noted that Pound had made the decision under extreme stress with incomplete information, which was true, but didn't change the fact that 150 men had died as a result. PQ-17 reveals something fundamental about command, intelligence, and the fog of war. The remote command problem. Admiral Pound was making tactical decisions from London based on intelligence reports that were hours out of date. He couldn't see the convoy, couldn't assess the tactical situation directly, couldn't consult with the officers on scene. This is the fundamental problem of remote command. The person with authority lacks information. The person with information lacks authority. Commander Broom went with the convoy but could see that there was no immediate threat. His assessment was that maintaining formation was correct, but he had no authority to override Pound's order. Pound, in London, had the authority but not the information. His last update had the Tirpitz at sea heading toward the convoy. He didn't know she'd turned back. He made a decision based on outdated intelligence. Modern military command and control systems are designed to address this problem through real-time communication. In 1942, communication meant signal lamps and radio telegrams with hours of delay. The intelligence failure. The British intelligence system had detected the Tirpitz's sortie accurately. What it failed to detect, or failed to communicate quickly enough, was her return to port. This is the other side of the intelligence problem. It's not enough to know what the enemy was doing hours ago. You need to know what he's doing now. The Tirpitz turned back at approximately 9 p.m. on July 4th. The scatter order was sent at 9:36 p.m. the same day, possibly while the intelligence about the Tirpitz's withdrawal was still being processed in London. If Pound had waited another few hours, if the intelligence about the withdrawal had reached him before he made the decision, PQ-17 would be a footnote rather than a disaster. The tyranny of worst-case thinking. Pound's decision was driven by worst-case scenario planning. Assume the Tirpitz attacks. Assume she destroys multiple ships before escorts can respond. Assume heavy losses. To avoid that worst case, he ordered scatter, which guaranteed heavy losses from a different source. This is the trap of worst-case thinking. It can lead to decisions that create the disaster you're trying to avoid, just from a different direction. The rational decision: maintain convoy formation, trust the escort, accept that some losses might occur if the Tirpitz attacked, was psychologically harder because it meant accepting risk. Scattering felt like action, like doing something to prevent disaster. In reality, it was creating disaster through different means. Today, at the bottom of the Barents Sea, lie the wrecks of 24 merchant ships from Convoy PQ-17. Some were torpedoed and sank intact. Others were bombed and broke apart. A few burned to the waterline before settling to the seafloor. Their graves. Over 150 merchant seamen died on those ships or in the freezing water after abandoning them. They were civilians doing a job that happened to involve sailing through war zones. They weren't soldiers. Most had never fired a weapon. Their contribution to the war was carrying cargo, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, from Allied factories to Soviet forces. They did this knowing Arctic convoys were dangerous, knowing U-boats hunted these waters, knowing German aircraft attacked regularly. But they also sailed believing that convoy formation meant safety, that escorts would protect them, that tactical decisions would be made by people who could see the tactical situation. Instead, they were ordered to scatter by an admiral in London who believed, incorrectly, that a battleship that had already turned back was about to attack. So they scattered, and they died. Admiral Pound made the decision believing he was saving the convoy. He was wrong. The Tirpitz never came. The scattered ships were picked off one by threats that convoy formation could have defended against. Pound died knowing this. The decision haunted his final years. But the men in the water, freezing in lifeboats, watching their ships burn, they died not knowing why. Not understanding that the order to scatter had been based on a threat that didn't exist. They just knew they'd been told to run, and then they'd been hunted down anyway. 24 ships, 150 men, lost because an admiral made a decision based on intelligence that was out of date. If you want to understand command failure, the fog of war, and how decisions made in safety can doom men in danger, subscribe. Because PQ-17 wasn't sunk by the Tirpitz. It was sunk by the fear of the Tirpitz. And that might be worse.